Greetings to you all and welcome to our event. I want to extend my profound gratitude for those of you all joining us, both near and far, relative to the Bay Area of California. Again, my name is Joshua Acosta. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Ethnic Studies here at the University of California at Berkeley, and a member of the Filipinx and Philippine Studies graduate working group here. It's my privilege to join in your company as we embark on what I know will be an insightful and enjoyable discussion. Firstly, I want to share my thanks for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here, whose sponsorship has made our event today possible. So again, a profound thank you to Vice Chair Sarah Maxim and those working with her in coordinating and publicizing our event. I also want to give a shout out to all of my colleagues at the Filipinx and Philippine Studies Graduate Working Group and our chair, Alex Mabanta, for supporting and co-hosting this proceeding. And with that, let me now turn over to introducing our incredible guest who is tuning in with us. Professor Allan E.S. Lumba is assistant professor in the Department of History at Virginia Tech. Exemplifying a truly West Coast education, he received his PhD in history from the University of Washington at Seattle, an MA in history from San Francisco State University, and a BS in history from Oregon State University. And as a fellow Cal State alum, I'm very happy to see this trajectory. Prior to his appointment on the faculty at Virginia Tech, Professor Lumba was a postdoctoral researcher in the Society of Fellows at the University of Michigan. He was also a Global American Studies Fellow at Harvard University and a Fulbright recipient. His research has explored the entanglement of money, race, colonialism, and power relations within the context of the Philippines, the United States, and the world. His talk today, titled Counter-Decolonization, Policing Money and Race During the Long Philippine American War, will draw on these concepts, which are formative insights that take shape in his forthcoming book, which is titled Monetary Authorities, Capitalism and Decolonization in the American Colonial Philippines. And the book is slated to be released and published by Duke University Press later this spring. And let me just say that I'm happy to see his work joining a longer pantheon of books in Filipino American and Philippine studies, particular to Duke University Press, but also in the wider range of books that have come out and are slated to be released in the coming months. Now, before I hand it over to Professor Lumba, I just wanted to add as a personal point of courtesy, and I'm not sure if he remembers this, but a few years ago when I was preparing to apply for graduate school, I had reached out to him via a close family friend. Shout out to Tito JR if he ever sees this, to gain his insights about what I should do, people I should seek out for mentorship, and the rest. And for those joining us, whether or not you've been through the graduate school experience or are planning through it or are currently in it, I'm sure these questions have orbited around you at some point. And it just goes to show how connected our intimate networks are and how they inform our own scholarly work and our scholarly trajectory in this field and in the space in the academy. And so to be here today and virtually welcoming him here is really a big deal for me. And I'm really glad that he was able to join us. And us Filipino history majors should stick together, right? So I hope that this will be one of many more engagements we will have to further the field and ask critical questions, both in the historic and contemporary affairs, as really engage and learn from him. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Allan Lumba to our virtual stage, and please give him a big Berkeley welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Joshua. That's such a sweet introduction. Very flattering, of course. And just going to share my thing real quick. Hopefully it's working. And I will just do this real quick. Okay. So first, just wanted to acknowledge that I'm that I work and live in Tagalog-Monacan land, contested land, and just want to acknowledge that before beginning my talk. Also, again, thank you to Joshua Acosta for the introduction and for, of course, moderating the Q&A afterwards. Thank you to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and to the Filipinx and Philippine Studies Working Group. Shout out to Alex Mabanta for this sponsorship. And of course, a special thank you to Sarah Maxim for all the hard work behind the scenes stuff, and especially just organizing the event and getting this off the ground. In 1896, Filipino revolutionaries attempted to liberate the Philippines from 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. Although leadership would eventually be driven to exile, the revolution would remain undomesticated by Spanish authorities. In 1898, the United States would defeat the Spanish in an inter-imperial war and purchase the Philippine Islands for $20 million, disavowing Filipino claims to sovereignty. Immediately, Filipino revolutionaries would take up arms to resist US military occupation. Within the first 2 years of the war, 250,000 Filipinos would die from combat, disease, and famine, countless more maimed, disabled, and displaced. For almost a decade and a half, armed insurgencies would continue throughout the islands, necessitating the continued institutional presence of US military in the archipelago. The war's effect on Filipino life and land was profound. For instance, due to malnutrition, epidemics, and the destruction of livestock and crops, the population level and the economy would stagnate for over a decade and would not reach pre-war levels until the early 1910s. As a consequence, various scholars have argued for the significance of the long war to understanding the history of US imperialism. For instance, Paul Kramer has called it a modern race war, introducing a new racial language to US military conquest. Dylan Rodriguez has labeled it a genocidal war, arguing that mass death remains at the foundation of American immigrant narratives. And most recently, Moonho Jung has argued that the war lays at the heart of the modern US security state. In contribution to these findings, I would argue that the war is profoundly relevant to histories of global racial capitalism. Indeed, Americans justified war's devastation by arguing that colonialism would uplift the Filipino race out of savagery and poverty, giving the native a more economically secure and stable life. A colonial monetary system would be key in this imperial promise. For instance, Charles Conant, an American economic expert and the future main architect of the new monetary system in the American colonial Philippines, argued in 1898 that it was the duty of Anglo-Americans to spread civilization to Asia and Africa, which had, quote, not felt the pulse of modern progress. To Conant, spreading US capital to what he called half-savage lands was part of the natural law of, quote, economic and race development. Using the language of racial paternalism, the spread of Anglo-American civilization was inevitable, even if it necessitated imperial methods of force. As Conant stated, I am a strong believer in imperialism, in the sense that the advanced powers should open the undeveloped countries to civilization and introduce among them the machinery of modern production, commerce, and finance. My book, Monetary Authorities, Capitalism, and Decolonization in the American Colonial Philippines, explores the worlds made and unmade by Conant and other economic experts and decision makers like him. Specifically, I examine how money from the late 19th century through the 1930s worked to justify racial, class, and heteropatriarchal orders, enforce capitalist exploitation, and oppose Philippine liberation. But now that I've done this quick plug for my book, I wanted to outline the more specific arguments I make about money and race during the long Philippine American War. The first section makes the case to unsettle narratives of US history through what I call counter-decolonization, examining in particular the policing of race and money during the long Philippine American War. Here I will map how and why economic expertise and a new colonial monetary system would be key in the broader campaigns of counter-decolonization. I then explore how the policing of race and money would be crucial for counter-decolonization, focusing in on why this regulation would be deliberately uneven. Uneven policing would justify racial and heteropatriarchal hierarchies and simultaneously produce differences between colonial subjects as either subjects of the law or subjects to the law. Finally, I examine how policing race and money was not only negative or punitive, but also productive. Indeed, counter-decolonization, in order to reproduce its own conditions, was a necessary component of racial capitalist accumulation in the colony and US empire. More concretely, I trace how the colonial monetary system was fundamentally necessary for US military logistics, generating profits for the nascent colonial state and the creation of urban and frontier infrastructural projects. The long Philippine American War, a war from approximately 1899 to 1913, holds much significance to students of the 20th century. The US colonial war in the Philippines offers a lens to think about a racial capitalist world system, a system that had transformed itself into the more recognizable modern system we live with today, one based on narratives of free labor and free markets, as opposed to the reality of slavery, its afterlives, and economies of dispossession. Relatedly, the long Philippine American War illustrates how a racial capitalist world system is fundamentally structured by interlocking colonialisms, settler and extractive, and is a generative optic to think about what I call counter-decolonization, the eradication or domestication of ongoing future movements for liberation and self-determination. US counter-decolonization was deeply shaped by the United States' origins as a settler colony, white supremacist society, and capitalist empire. Here I build off Manu Karuka's concept of counter-sovereignty. Quote, a position of reaction to distinct indigenous protocols governing life in the spaces the United States claims as its national interior. By situating US empire first as a settler colony, I want to emphasize that decolonization was anterior to expansion. This emphasis on decolonization recasts US empire, and perhaps other 19th century capitalist empires, as fundamentally historical forces against collective liberation. This is especially clear in the first half of the 19th century. During this period, US empire first expanded through frontier wars with indigenous and Mexican peoples, and second, through the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine, and later the Tyler Doctrine, which sought to crowd out other capitalist empires throughout the Western Hemisphere, placing liberated indigenous or other decolonizing peoples under US formal or informal dominion. In the last decades of the 19th century, US empire was unapologetic as it pursued counter-decolonization across vast bodies of water in the settler colony of Hawaii, the former Spanish colonies Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Mariana Islands, Guam, and the Philippines. At the same time, US counter-decolonization is fundamentally reactionary. I situate the Philippines within the long durée of crises and upheavals of racial capitalism during the 19th century, or what could also be considered the age of revolutionary decolonization. It is clear that the 1896 Philippine Revolution was part of and continued a deep and vast tradition of independence movements of former Spanish colonies that swept across Latin America during the 19th century. But I also think of the Philippine Revolution as part of a rich tradition of liberation movements that not only centered sovereignty, but also abolition, such as the 1791 Haitian Revolution, the 1860s general strike of enslaved Black Americans in the United States, or the countless eruptions of slave uprising throughout the Western Hemisphere. It is this historical tension between the two poles of the long 19th century of revolutionary decolonization and counter-decolonization that makes the Philippine American War an event that was both world-shaping and world-building, both part of and contributing to the making and potential unmaking of global racial capitalism. More concretely, the pretense of bringing capitalist development to and securing capitalist accumulation in the Philippine colony was constantly undermined by the disorder brought about by US counter-decolonization. For American colonial officials, one of the primary forms of achieving counter-decolonization was, on one hand, the institution of a colonial currency, and on the other hand, the maintenance of racial hierarchies. The kind of money a society used was indicative of its economic capacity and hence its civilizational status. From the early to mid 19th century, the British Empire, the world's most powerful empire at the time, had deployed imperial and colonial force to establish the gold standard system as the global universal standard. By the end of the 19th century, North Atlantic capitalist empires, such as the United States, had followed suit in naturalizing the gold standard, ideologically and in practice. What is significant is that the naturalization of the gold standard operated in tandem with the naturalization of global white supremacy and racial hierarchy. There were gold countries, countries that were rich, civilized, and white, and there were silver countries, countries that were poor, uncivilized, and dark. Where a society landed in the gold and non-gold binary indicated where one was in terms of racialized civilization. The Philippine colony under the Spanish operated under a de facto silver system. For Americans, lifting up Filipinos out of silver meant bringing gold to the islands. It meant binding Filipinos to a gold standard monetary system based on a US gold dollar. This would bring order and security to an archipelago that had suffered under what Theodore Roosevelt called medieval tyranny and savage anarchy. Roosevelt warned of the grave problems of the Philippines, whose racial disorder of, quote, half-caste native Christians, warlike Muslims, and wild pagans made them utterly unfit for self-government and show no signs of becoming fit. To the future US president, therefore, sovereignty must be violently withheld, at least until racial and economic order could become firmly established. Policing money and regulating race went hand in hand. The main agents of this twinned form of counter-decolonization were American economic experts. Economic experts were crucial to US imperial projects, justifying violent colonial economic policies through a combination of white supremacy, racial paternalism, and heteropatriarchy. Composed mainly of academics, bankers, and businessmen, and they almost always identified as men, many of these experts were drawn to the US empire's new colonial frontier in the Philippines for several intertwining reasons. This included proving economic and racial theories, advancing their individual careers, personally profiting from colonial investments, living out a masculine fantasy of frontier exploration, or seeing it as their paternalistic duty to uplift savage peoples. Economic experts even conceptualized colonial money in the Philippines as a continuation of settler colonial practices, part of a longer heritage of white supremacy in the North American continent. One press release from the War Department attempted to resonate with the broader public through a nostalgic narrative of US capitalism. The idea of a special coin for colonial dependencies, distinct from those of the realm, is by no means new. In fact, it is as old as the colonial system of Great Britain and the now United States of America, and apparently originated for use right here on our own soil within about 5 years of the first prominent foothold of the white man on the North American continent. The press release would thus connect the creation of the Philippine colonial currency in America's quote-unquote Asiatic archipelago to the United States' inheritance as a settler colony and its subsequent obligation to spreading white civilization to supposedly uncivilized peoples. However, once in the Philippine colony, experts found themselves flummoxed by the combination of hostile material conditions and the resistance of colonized subjects to US currency. One newspaper article warned that, quote, American money was discredited, causing perversities, complexities, difficulties, and impossibilities. Another article claimed that, quote, all the natural cursedness of the climate and all the artificial eccentricities of the place and people were concentrated in the currency. The main supposed victims of silver-based money was the US colonial military. Indeed, the most pressing logistical concerns of US military occupation consisted of purchasing supplies, paying wages for colonial labor, and dispersing paychecks to soldiers. All these arrangements necessitated a stable supply of cash. Almost immediately after the US claimed sovereignty over the Philippines, military ranks would swell to an estimated 70,000 troops, who all required cash to be clothed, fed, and remunerated. Moreover, because the US military was an occupying population filled with soldiers involved in a protracted war against native insurrectos, the stabilization of day-to-day banking services and commercial and retail transactions became even more important to maintain a sense of normalcy and morale. Ongoing work stoppages and strikes conducted by tens of thousands of Filipino workers throughout the official war years would intensify American insecurities. Workers articulated these refusals not only as a worker cause, but also as anti-colonial demands. It is within this situation that the security of money became a pressing concern of imperial decision makers, economic experts, and military leaders. And it is within the mundane activity of managing logistics that concerns over monetary insecurities revealed multiple frictions between different colonial agents. Even after the 1903 rollout of the new gold-based coins, so after the introduction of a new American colonial currency, the conants, as they would commonly be called, would frequently be looked at with suspicion by both colonizer and colonized. Newspaper headlines would refer to the new currency as queer, mongrel money, or bastard coins, indicating the doubtful genealogies and thus authenticity of such money. In addition, the new colonial monetary system was introduced despite the fact that the war was far from over, stretching on for at least another decade. As a consequence of protracted and guerrilla warfare, Americans on the ground remained unsettled, with Filipino amigos frequently looked upon with suspicion. Money was simultaneously viewed by authorities as possibly working against colonization efforts, undermining the security of US sovereignty, either through counterfeiting or smuggling, or by flowing to enemies of the colonial state. In response, American authorities looked to policing strategies of other imperial powers in Southeast Asia. As historian Eric Tagliacozo has shown, during the last decades of the 19th century, British and Dutch colonial authorities struggled to regulate the vast circulation of contraband that circulated in the frontiers of what is now Singapore, Malaysia, and India. In the case of the Philippines, however, much of the newly minted coins were often smuggled to spaces under other empires, such as Hong Kong. Because of this, Chinese and Chinese mestizos were often heavily policed and surveyed by American authorities. More generally, American authorities apprehended activities such as smuggling, counterfeiting, refusals to use the new coins, or even the quotidian contestation of the value of currency as an affront to US colonial authority and a possible form of encouraging movements for decolonization. Through policing money's daily and routine uses, economic experts would subsequently dedicate themselves to what I call counter-decolonization, or the strategy of suppressing or domesticating any threat of Philippine liberation. Thus, my argument is not simply that experts were racial paternalists justifying the spread of Anglo-American civilization, but that fundamental notions of racial hierarchy structured colonial wars against and economic dominance over those they saw as racially unfit for sovereignty. The policing of race and money, however, was deployed unevenly. In one form, monetary authorities would attempt to elicit consent through collaboration. White Americans and Europeans in the banking and business communities who resisted using the new colonial currency were invited to collaborate with state decision-making. In another form, non-white colonial subjects were heavily surveyed and punished, suspected of undermining the new system. The division of currency was the main monetary authority that instituted counter-decolonization during the long Philippine American War. Beginning in 1903, the chief of the division, Edwin Kemmerer, would oversee this policing of race and money, deliberately ensuring that this regulation remained uneven, producing subjects within an imperial field as white or non-white, colonizer or colonized, free or unfree, as subjects of law or subjects to law. Let us look, for instance, at this uneven policing during the early rollout of the new colonial currency. Two main money problems plagued Kemmerer and other colonial authorities throughout this process. The first involved a small circle of bankers, and the second involved the broader population. More specifically, the first problem was the refusal of bankers to transition from older currencies to the new American colonial currency. Although bankers publicly welcomed the additional security and stability promised by the new US colonial currency based on the gold standard, they nevertheless believed changes were being imposed too quickly, hindering their ability to profit from wartime transitions. Composed mostly of white Europeans, Filipino mestizos, and some Americans, the banking community was tied mainly to London, not New York. Their interests were to make sure exchange rates with British colonies, especially Singapore and Hong Kong, remained manageable and profitable. Moreover, although less stable, the bulk of the local currency cash balances of major banks was made up of older silver-based currencies. During this liminal moment of transition between currencies, the banking and business community took advantage of an unaware public who continued to misapprehend the differences in values between the old and new coins. Local wages and prices continued to be set according to silver-based money. The older coins also held less value than the new US colonial coins. As a consequence, bankers, capitalists, and merchants continued to exploit the cheaper currency, both in terms of local payroll and purchases, and in terms of settling foreign balances. Several prominent American decision makers were irritated by this practice, seeing it as a roadblock to establishing a colonial monetary system tied directly to the US gold dollar. In response, so as to force bankers and business leaders to more rapidly accept the new American colonial currency, several state authorities began to publicly float the idea of imposing a 20% tax on silver-based currencies at the end of January 1904. Bankers reacted strongly against the possible tax and complained that this was a radical attack on the financial community. One banker argued that what was hampering the introduction of the new monetary system was not the banking community, but instead the ignorance of colonial society. Natives, according to this banker, did not have any knowledge of the market. They were therefore more liable to naively cling to the older and more familiar coins. Moreover, this banker asserted that the true culprit slowing down monetary reforms were the Chinese. According to rumors, Chinese merchants had ransacked all the provinces for older silver-based currencies in order to turn a profit in the international money markets. Kemmerer agreed with many of the arguments made by bankers and would help organize an opportunity to collaborate with them. On January 24th, 1904, a secret and private meeting between colonial officials and representatives from the main banks was held at Malacañang Palace, the civil colonial government headquarters. Kemmerer would also attend this meeting. Frictions had intensified as, quote, the banks and the chambers of commerce came out strongly in opposition to the new tax. And this late night meeting was organized to field suggestions from bankers on how to best transition from the Spanish era currencies. Bankers eventually accepted a proposal by Kemmerer, and this proposal promised to hold off on considering currency taxes until later that year, instead focusing on educating natives through a colony-wide public relations campaign. The practice of inviting bankers who were considered subjects of law to co-create colonial economic policy was vastly different from those considered subjects to law. The primary targets of economic experts during the Long War were those on the lower rungs of the heteropatriarchal racial and class hierarchy. Unlike white American and European bankers and capitalists, experts would routinely go above and beyond to make an example of those racialized as non-white. Kemmerer would obsess over these different groups, criminalizing, for example, Chinese merchants, Filipino market women, and non-Christian indigenous people. In different ways, Filipino women and the indigenous were seen as potential anti-authoritarians, using daily small-scale economic practices that seemed to operate autonomously from or against American colonial authority. Natives, furthermore, lacked market knowledge, and because of this racialized ignorance, supposedly the parasitic Chinese would prey on them. If these kinds of injustices accumulated, colonial authorities worried it could possibly generate more political and economic insecurities, undermining counter-decolonization efforts. Let us look, for instance, at the surveillance of Chinese as swindlers and smugglers of older silver-based currencies. Rather than target the more powerful and influential multi-colonial banks, suspicions were frequently cast upon Chinese money changers. In Kemmerer's reports, Chinese money changers were believed to illegally profit from the general public's confusion over the slow rollout of small denomination US currency coins by, quote, charging the same prices in Philippine currency that they formerly charged in local currency. This, of course, to remind you, this is what the bankers were doing, right? But it was a problem when Chinese were doing it. Chinese were also frequently criminalized as smugglers. From 1905 until the middle of 1906, the price of silver violently changed to a premium. As a result, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million of the new and old silver coins were smuggled out of the colony through territories where there had yet to be a clear state monopolization of currency. Silver coins were then exported to Hong Kong, Amoy, and other Chinese coastal markets. And the colonial state reacted by changing the silver bullion content of the coins, instituting a massive recoinage process that lasted 2 years between 1906 and 1908. Moreover, there were reports of immense refusals of the new coins from the frontier parts of the archipelago that were blamed mostly on Chinese merchant networks. But the state, of course, would collaborate with native business and foreign firms and companies, and the colonial government was eventually able to discipline any public refusals. Considered resolved at the time, the recoinage process left unaccounted an estimated 2.7 million pesos worth of coins. Looking back, however, so this was usually blamed on Chinese merchants, but looking back, multiple American economic experts believe that the unaccounted coins ended up in the possession of British-owned banks and firms throughout the coastal cities of Asia. In addition to the Chinese, working Filipino women were often surveyed by monetary authorities. For example, one local authority wrote to Kemmerer about the deployment of a kind of stop and search tactic at Divisoria Market, one of the busiest commercial areas in Manila. He boasted of, quote, of stopping, quote, an old woman selling native fruits and searching within her box of change and finding illegal local currency clackers. Instead of a mere warning, he would drag the woman and her coppers with him to the municipal treasurer. He then forced her to not only exchange her coins for the new colonial currency in front of him, but also forced her to make an oath and sign, quote, an affidavit that she understood the currency laws and would not hereafter transact any business in local currency without having procured a license. Only after this public spectacle of punishment was she, quote, released and instructed to return to her work. The Chinese and Filipino market women were not the only ones criminalized by their relation to small denomination coins. Non-Christian Filipinos, those considered uncivilized or pre-modern, such as the indigenous people of the northern Philippines, racially categorized as Igorots, were frequently seen as sources of counterfeit and irritants to the new currency. This was especially clear in the frontier mountainous regions of colonial rule. The vast majority of the colonized population, especially those in the border zones between civil and military governments, commonly use coins privately made by Igorot peoples. One particular non-sanctioned currency that irritated provincial officials were called Igorot coppers. The Igorots were primarily figured as primitive and violent, undomesticated by Spanish colonial authority or Christian Filipino culture. The coins that would earn their name would also be considered primitive and undomesticated, violent to colonial authority. For example, colonial officials claimed that Igorot coins were, quote, extremely rude counterfeit coins created by private and untraceable agents. As such, there was no sovereign bank or state to back up the value of the coins. One had to merely place faith in the metallic content inherent in the coins themselves in order to give it value. The value logic of Igorot coins seemed to operate on an authority autonomous from American colonial authority. Half a year after the introduction of the new colonial coins, US officials were still using Igorot copper. The US military government officials, in their haste for counter-decolonization, continued to disperse Igorot coins to pay for native labor, food, and other supplies. Additionally, regional capitalists continued to use it for both business transaction and government obligations. Thus, American colonial authority, especially regional military officials, continued to depend daily on money created by a supposedly inferior race. As a consequence, experts like Kemmerer would obsess about driving out the Igorot coins from circulation. First, by creating more surveillance to capture and remove the coins from circulation. And second, by pouring more resources into the production of American-made small denomination coins. So basically, Kemmerer wanted to replace these coins with the creation of new, smaller coins. The example of creating replacement coins to drive out Igorot coins illustrates that regulating money was almost always a productive process, a practice and logic of accumulation. Policing was thus not simply a process of imposing negative or punitive measures. Counter-decolonization policing also meant generating a sense of security and order for those invested in colonial occupation and capital accumulation. As a form of counter-decolonization, the creation of a new monetary system created profits for trans-Pacific financial institutions, enabled the smooth and predictable movement of money for military logistics, and bankrolled large-scale infrastructural projects in both settled and frontier territories. For instance, the establishment of a new monetary system and the maintenance of a stable exchange rate between the Philippine peso and the US dollar would entail the creation of several currency funds. The cash in these currency funds were necessary for war logistics. In 1904 alone, US military expenditures on labor resources and construction in the Philippine colony was estimated at $1 million a month by authorities at the time. However, historians have accounted for over $400 million in expenditures just for the formal 3-year war. This is all to say, US military spending would flood the archipelago with new coins. However, because the money held in the colonial treasury could not keep up with military spending, the colonial currency fund did most of the heavy lifting to keep cash flowing for war operations. The colonial currency fund was thus a vital lifeline for counter-decolonization military logistics. At the same time, the new colonial currency benefited from military spending. As one of the major employers in the colony during the ongoing war, all wages and debts had to be legally paid out in the Conant-designed coin. The everyday operations of the US military would enable the normalization of the colonial monetary system. Thus, in a very material sense, US military occupation and the establishment of a colonial currency worked in tandem in counter-decolonization efforts, one in the realm of war and the other in the realm of the economy. Other than supporting military logistics, the colonial monetary system also generated profits, directly benefiting both the nascent civil colonial government and the Wall Street banks that acted as currency reserves. Let us look, for example, to 1910. After a decade of protracted war in the colony, Charles Conant decreed not only, quote, the success of the experiment in the Philippines, but also a good profit on coinage. Much like other colonial experiments, for instance, in British India, Conant argued that the Philippine currency system safeguarded a racial and imperial hierarchy between the metropole and colony. It would also, as economist Yoshiko Nagano has argued, work to potentially place a check on British economic power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Conant boasted of the profits made from, quote, the seigniorage on the coinage, the sale of drafts, and interest on deposits in American banks. Additional profits, mainly through the transnational sale of securities, were also generated. Indeed, as one 1913 audit showed, in less than a decade, the combined interest on deposits and exchange sales alone had netted the US government over $3.5 million. Through the maintenance of a massive currency system of about 51 million pesos worth of circulating coins, US colonial authorities had accumulated enough capital to fund the civil and military colonial governments, provide liquidity for US private banks, and generate credit for future counter-decolonization projects. By the beginning of the 1910s, American experts claimed that monetary experiments in the Philippines could result in a translatable model, one that could be quickly employed throughout other racialized economies. At the same time, Conant and others like him would professionally profit from the knowledge accumulated in the archipelago. As historians Peter Hudson and Emily Rosenberg have convincingly argued, the Philippine colony would inspire other experts and bankers throughout Latin America and the Caribbean for decades to come. In addition to US military occupation and financial profits, colonial currency funds were foundational for the proliferation of government enterprises in public infrastructure. Profits from the monetary system provided loans to finance various large-scale projects, such as port building, water and sewage lines, electrical grids, roads, and railroads. These considerable profits gained the attention of ambitious colonial officials such as William Cameron Forbes, he's here on the far right, who had grand plans of building a cutting-edge railroad system to connect the non-Christian mountainous regions of northern Luzon to the Christian regions of southern Luzon. The railroad would ideally aid the military settling of non-Christian frontiers and provide new pathways for capital to circulate and accumulate. Forbes would also approve the rerouting of several substantial loans to the building of the Manila Hotel and other municipal public works, appeasing the Philippine business community and urban capitalists. Loans from the currency fund thus provided seed money for real estate and infrastructural projects, which in turn would generate bonds and securities for local and foreign investors. This further entangled US finance capital with US colonization efforts and repeated the cycle of capital accumulation across the Pacific. Through the exploration of several historical examples, my talk today examined the importance of counter-decolonization in better unsettling histories of US colonization and US empire. I also examined how and why the policing of race and money, guided in particular by economic experts, was profoundly necessary to counter-decolonization. Yet policing was deliberately uneven, asymmetrically privileging those categorized as subjects of law, while punishing those determined to be subjects to law. This uneven policing was meant to justify colonial violence and reinforce racial, class, and heteropatriarchal orders. Authorities would obsess over these different groups, criminalizing Chinese merchants, Filipina market women, and non-Christian indigenous tribespeople. The capture and punishment of those on the lower rungs of colonial society was in stark difference from the policing of white and mestizo bankers, whose refusal to recognize US colonial authority were often not only tolerated, but in many ways rewarded with an invitation to collaboratively create monetary policy. As this talk examined, policing was also productive, a key component in racial capitalist accumulation. Counter-decolonization created mechanisms to not only create a sense of security for capital, but also to generate new sites of investment. The colonial monetary system created by American experts would pay off in dividends for US colonizing efforts during the long Philippine American War. The construction and maintenance of the colonial currency would especially be key in financing military logistics, generating profits for the US colonial state, and enabling numerous infrastructural projects across the archipelago. Finally, by reckoning with the history of US counter-decolonization, I hope to contribute to unsettling what Lisa Lowe has asserted as the archives of liberalism, or as I would argue, the archives of alibis. These archives of alibis have traditionally framed US historiography, perpetuating white supremacist narratives of historical progress, civilizational advancement, and individualized liberties, rather than a history fundamentally shaped by global structures of antagonisms, crises, and unfreedoms. Reframing modern US history or US empire through the lens of counter-decolonization perhaps also helps us rethink the United States as an empire constantly reacting to an anarchic multitude of historical actors that desired collective liberation and self-determination, from indigenous peoples fighting against dispossession to Black peoples fighting for abolition, and for other colonized peoples of color, like those in the Philippines, fighting for anti-authoritarian forms of autonomy and sovereignty. Thank you.
Years now. Anyway, thank you again, Alan, for being with us and give us a chance to learn from you. And I think that these are crucial insights and interventions in how we think about the histories of colonialism in the Philippines and its relationship to the world. So I'm gonna turn over to there's a question here for you from Joshua Garcia. He's a member of our working group. He writes, "Thank you for the stimulating and generative talk. I have what might be a basic question because this is not the time period I work in, but I find it really interesting that you situated the Philippines at that time with similar uprisings for self-determination in other colonized nations around the world at the time. How familiar were the Filipinos at this time with those happenings? Or was there something about the intellectual atmosphere, in essence, the tail end of the Age of Enlightenment?"
That's a great question. Yeah, I think for me, I'm also just, building off of other people's findings and about thinking about the Philippine Revolution as part of this larger constellation of radical and revolutionary thinking. So there's plenty of sort of really great histories that have situated the Philippine Revolution, the kind of material conditions, as well as the intellectual conditions, as drawing from the sort of the liberation movements across the Americas, of course, from former Spanish colonies. I think there is that idea of the, ilustrados, the kind of Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment kind of ideas about, individual liberties and freedoms and things like that. Of course, you could just look at something like The Promise of the Foreign by Vince Raphael, which really lays that out in the ways that it's both on several registers, thinking about revolution on several registers, both in terms of that Western kind of discourse, if you want to call it, but also the kind of history from below kind of revolutionary resistance that comes from something that goes beyond the ilustrado, or sort of this these kind of reformist demands for sovereignty, right? But I think a recent book by Moon Ho Jung is really informative, I think, and he brings together a lot of the different ways that it wasn't just simply the Spanish kind of constellation, right? And it's also building off of Ben Anderson's sort of speculations about anarchism specifically. It's not just the Spanish, sort of that Spanish liberal tradition, but rather it's also the radical tradition that comes out of sort of the anarchist movement in Spain and throughout the Americas as well. And also the massive labor movements that were happening in terms of this kind of, you could call it a general strike that was happening during the end of sort of the Spanish American War, but also throughout the first years of the long Philippine American War, right? You have all these massive strikes by workers, and in these kind of refusals and in these kinds of forms of withholding labor, right? There was a way that they maybe started to radicalize in terms of how they were thinking, beyond just simply thinking about individual rights or even notions of state sovereignty, but rather something that actually drew from these kind of other revolutionary ideas that were happening. And I think for me, that is the most interesting ideas, is thinking about how, or at least trying to think with others about how the Philippine Revolution and and I would say like the fact that the Philippine American War was so long, right? That the argument is that that doesn't ever stop, right? The revolution doesn't really stop, is because of this longer Philippine radical tradition. Um, in the same way that thinking through it in the same way that someone like Cedric Robinson was thinking about the Black radical tradition, thinking about Marinage, thinking about these centuries of different uprisings throughout those enslaved as not something that's just sporadic and sort of unconscious type of reactions, but actually these are conscious and organized movements, right? By those that were enslaved, but also rehearsals for what would become more recognizable as a Black radical tradition. So the kind of radical intellectuals that you would see in the 20th century, like Du Bois or C.L.R. James and others. In the same way, can we think about people like that we think of as the Ilustrados, or even the more radical communist organizers or socialist organizers or labor organizers in the 20th century who were Filipino, as drawing from a kind of tradition of a radical tradition that were rehearsals for sort of a more recognizable intellectual tradition, if that makes sense. So I mean, I'm trying to say that yes, I think there's something else happening, and I think that's what I'm hoping to think through with others in terms of that we've kind of inherited a kind of a history, and I teach this the same way about the Enlightenment, or not the Enlightenment, about Ilustrados and their relation to the Katipunan and all those kind of things. But I think there's there are other kind of histories happening that we can think about and think through, especially when we start looking at the more formal, the first Communist Party of the Philippines, or the Sacralistas, or all these kind of peasant uprisings, and to think through more through the radical tradition rather than thinking about it as just coming out of like a Spanish intellectual tradition.
I think bridging off of that, this next question is sort of building on that and sort of thinking about this through line, this intellectual through line, and how we can connect all of these together. And we have a observation and question from Sid S, who writes, "One of the things that I find fascinating / infuriating is the fact that most Filipinos recognize that we were colonized by Spain, but you don't necessarily get that type of language / acknowledgement of the US being a colonizer. Why is this not a part of our communal Filipino understanding? And what can we do to highlight the role of the United States as a colonizer?"
That's a good question. It's also sort of a common question, I guess, in terms of a lot of Philams. It all depends too. I mean, I think different communities have different relations to the US in terms of some grew up in more like labor organizer type situations. Some were, anti, martial law, and they had like longer and part of the radical movements in the Philippines and the US or Canada or wherever that grew up with a very critical perspective to US empire, right? And even though they come to it differently, but I think you're right in terms of mainstream representation of these kinds of, or the reproduction of a particular kind of normative history of the Philippines. You usually see the US as not considered a colonizing force. If anything, they might admit, I mean, I think that it was under the US in terms of legally, right? In terms of status, because that itself is part of the language that the United States uses as an empire that denies its own colonizing history. And again, I think it is, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, is we have to think of the Philippines as part of sort of these interlocking colonialisms, right? That it's not just simply that the US becomes a an empire because it goes across the Pacific or across the Caribbean, but rather it's from the jump, from the start, right? From its foundation, it's a settler colony, right? So when we start to reframe how we think about the US, we start to see it opens up all these questions about the kinds of relations it has to the rest of the world, right? And so when you think about empire or US empire, oftentimes it's talked about in terms of soft, so soft power, right? That's a common term where it's like, oh, through US money, they can influence this, blah, blah, blah. But there's always, there's always violence that's backing it up, right? There's always the CIA can always come in, or the military is there. And the Philippines is a perfect example of this. It's one that is seen to be under over 3 decades of as a possession, and then eventually a commonwealth of the United States. But it usually, the war is usually this long war, very long war, drawn out war, right, is usually forgotten, right? If anything, they do acknowledge that there was a Philippine American War, and it ends, within 2 or 3 years, right? But that's sort of, again, one thing that I want to think through with others is the idea of what happens when we start to think about it as a long Philippine American War. How does this periodization start to change how we think about US diaspora, or the Filipinx diaspora, and of course the historical memory that is produced that kind of generates this kind of like archives of alibis, right? Sort of creating sort of these excuses for why the US really wasn't the same kind of colonizer, as brutal as other kind of empires, right? Compared to you can argue the Spanish or the Japanese or things like that, right? But rather, I think thinking about how brutal this war was, right? The actual long counter-decolonization, the depopulation level, millions, we don't get back to sort of before the war, right? I guess it's around 10, 11 million people. And then you don't get to 10, 11 million until the mid-teens, right? In terms of population itself, right? Philippine population. In terms of the actual ecological disasters that happen as a result of the Philippine American War, it's brutal, right? The kind of displacement, the kind of diseases that happen for vegetation, for animal life, it wipes out whole areas, right? And of course, there's also the slash and burn tactics and things like that. So I think one of the main takeaways from me is that this is not just simply about a legal status for the Philippines of, oh, they didn't have sovereignty and then eventually they got their self-government, but rather it was a serious, like, materially devastating event, right? And I think that's something that people don't understand about American colonialism, that it's just as brutal as World War II, right? And perhaps just as brutal as initial encounters with the Spanish, right? So I think that's something that I think it's a good reminder to ask that question constantly. So thank you.
Yeah, I think those are really good observations, and really emphasizing your point about drawing out as a kind of longer Philippine American War, right? And going beyond the initial conflict against guerrilla fighting and moving towards really formalizing US rule. One of the things that you wrote in the introduction, which I'll just read briefly, is that, quote, currency, because of its material and meaning-making functions, was essential to this promise of post-colonial capitalist security. And I think about how, often currency is associated as this kind of like proxy of value, like kind of transactional, right? But here, your argument seems to be suggesting that they're not simply proxies of values, but manifestations linked to a dense matrix of power relations that undergird all of these other projects in the Philippines, particularly with education, with health, and as you mentioned in the third part of your presentation, with infrastructure projects connecting urban and rural landscapes in the Philippines. So I think that these are really formative parts to think about sort of the longer durée of colonialism, going beyond military campaigns and into the more quotidian and maybe even mundane aspects. I even think about your use of images to think about the public market, for instance, and how money is shaping these relations both between colonized peoples and with the colonizer and the colonized.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I should have just had you rewrite everything. I think that's perfect. I think, yeah, I mean, I think as a materialist, you have to think about it in terms of relations of power. And, money obviously is like one of those famous things that people look at in terms of that connects people, but also creates the kind of hierarchies, right? Or asymmetrical relations between people. But it does, as you said, create the different kinds of, it's not just a representation, I guess, right? Of, as you said, it's not just a representation of these kind of power or acts as proxy of these kind of power relations, but really, as I would say, it produces a kind of practice, right? A normalization of particular kinds of activities or relations. And I think that's really significant in terms of what actually, at least what was intended by US colonial authorities was the security of those kinds of, or stabilization of those kinds of relations, right?
Right,
So
right.
to maintain those kind of hierarchies as they were producing them, right? So obviously it's always in flux. It's always, I believe that these racial categories are always changing according to particular, the terrain, the kind of political terrain, the kind of material terrain. But at the same time, it is always being shaped by structures of white supremacy and sort of anti-Indigenous, anti-Blackness, right? But mainly in the Philippines, anti-Indigenous, sort of these ideas of savage versus civilizational, things like that. And so this extends not just simply to the sort of discursive or the political language that you would see, so within diplomatic or all these things, but really it is about the nuts and bolts, the kind of, how are Filipina women using this money? How are the Chinese, what's their relation to the kind of coins and things like that? And how is that actually affecting, for example, wages or affecting the kind of commodities, prices of commodities, questions of inflation, things like that, right? So I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I hope, it's just like, hopefully it opens that up as defamiliarizes something that is kind of taken for granted and in a lot of Philippine history.
Yeah, for sure. I like the comment about that relational race making and thinking about how these processes are really intertwined and intimately woven to formalize and really reify the white settler state in the Philippines. As a continuation, of course, from the Indian Wars in the mainland United States following the Civil War, I think that these are very much tied together in thinking about inculcating a capitalist state to materialize the structures that continue to racialize. Are there any other questions from the audience that would like to chime in?
I had a short question.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Oops, I'm freezing. I see Vince Raphael's in the audience, so he may have a different take. But I was just wondering, a very basic question, how you got interested in this topic or how you chose this topic. Because I work on colonial history to some degree myself, and I just find it very interesting that you're starting with something that's very tangible and small that people don't even think about. I mean, I think Josh was actually sort of getting at this in his comments, but then you're building it up into a great, I think, worldview of the US colonization in the Philippines. I'm just curious how you even got to this point originally when you're doing your dissertation and so forth.
I mean, funny enough, it was, I mean, I've always been interested in political economy and sort of that idea of looking at institutions that are super boring and trying to say, okay, why is it so outside of social awareness that these are things that are constantly undergoing crisis and have so much power behind it. But I think, yeah, it started out as a graduate paper in Vince's class. Vince and Christoph Giebel were co-teaching a Southeast Asian survey graduate course. And this turned out to be the pitch that I had for a seminar paper. And then it just kind of built off into, thinking about money in terms of sort of the longer sort of American colonial period. But it started off around the Philippine American War. So it's just like, what is this new currency system? Is that Vince over there? Yes, we did do a Marx reading group, but I don't want to get red tagged here. No, no, we did a Marx reading group before that, and or was it before or after? I don't know. I feel like I was really into money at that point. But yeah, in terms of kind of like thinking about like the little things, like it's strange how little seminar papers here and there can actually turn into like a larger decade-long over a decade-long project.
That's great. Yeah, and I'm just finishing up writing one myself. So maybe
There
it
you
may
go.
germinate into something longer, right?
Maybe you were more put together than me though in grad school.
Let's see. Okay, we have another question from Allison Tiongson, who writes, how does money speak to the collective memory of the Philippines in the sense of the narrative of resistance with the history of about 400 years of foreign occupation, Spain, US, and Japan, being something that is almost cyclical and maybe not all that progressive if you're stuck in that loop, especially given how the nation is still suffering from the effects of martial law and what happened with Duterte's drug war? Would historical education and reparations from colonial powers be enough, especially regarding political dynasties too?
Those are some really interesting questions. I mean, I think there's several things. I think in terms of, if I understand it, it's trying to deal with sort of reckoning, right, with history, right? No, it's a great question. It's something that I think I've been thinking about in different ways, obviously, but I think historical memory is oftentimes, and it's obviously right now, not just right now, but obviously it's been the most, maybe the worst I've seen in my adult life in terms of the kind of information, I guess is the word, but definitely the kinds of ways of revisionism has gone to such circulate so fast, and so in the same way that money is untraceable, it's so difficult to go, okay, well, we'll just shut down this person and we'll just sort of try to shut down this bot or things like that, right? These different kind of memes that create re-narrate history to justify certain things like dictatorship, fascism, the kind of martial law, or the kind of mass atrocities of different dictators in the Philippines and elsewhere, right? And I think there is something about how money, I think looking at money, obviously the kind of plunder that occurs, the kind of accumulation that comes through dispossession and both biological as well as kind of the kind of actual financial or kind of economic dispossession, and the kind of exploitation and extraction that comes out of under these kinds of regimes, colonial and post-colonial regimes, I think is really significant. I think money, in a way, and to use sort of that idea of reckoning, and I don't know, I just suddenly blanked on the author, Reckoning with Slavery, which just came out last year. But reckoning, of course, in the same way, when we reckon with colonialism or the kind of post-colonial violence, reckoning both in terms of accounting, right, getting the receipts, but also reckoning in terms of trying to strive towards some sort of justice, I think is significant, is a very important way of thinking about money and how you can follow the money, but also you're following the money in this situation in order to also follow the kind of histories of violence, the histories of injustice, right? And to actually put those receipts out in the open as an act of defiance. And so I think even though people don't realize how much, for example, under the Marcoses, how much they plundered, how much they've extracted, not just in terms of directly, but also the kind of debt that was taken on by and extracted again by different generations, extracted from different generations of Filipinos and others. And so by having a sort of reckoning with that, I think through money, you start to understand more and more of the material consequences, right? Both in terms of a moral sense, but also in terms of a political economic sense. So I think it's totally, I think it's a valid question. I mean, it's one of those questions that are, I think a lot of historians and students of the Philippines are really reckoning with, or at least trying to deal with, in a way that, how do you deal with people who are just not necessarily ahistorical, but they are creating their own histories that don't properly or disavow the kind of proper reckoning with history. And so that's something I think that happens through, organizing, of course, but I think the work of different historians and for students is to do that sort of work, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a through line with Sid's question as well about reckoning with colonial amnesia and the United States sort of its legacies rooted in a humanitarian ethos, right? And I think you mentioned Lisa Lowe and the Archive of Liberalism, and then the Archive of Alibis, and you just described it near the end. I think that's sort of a major factor in the way we think about and remember these histories. Are there any other questions from our attendants today? Any final thoughts? If not, I'll turn it back over to Sarah. And I want to thank Allan again for this wonderful talk. And I could spend a lot longer talking about these, and I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities to really connect. And so again, thank you, Allan, for being here.
Thank you so much. It was
Thanks,
a pleasure.
Allan. Thanks for the audience. We will be posting this talk to YouTube in a bit. So for those of you who want to revisit it, and for those who weren't able to make today's timing, which was a little unusual for us. So thanks for coming, and feel free to log out.